Good afternoon. First and foremost, I apologize for not being able to take part in the previous 2 days of this conference due to teaching obligations, and take this opportunity to thank the organizers for including me. In late 1998 or early 1999, I had one of periodical discussions with Professor Lloyd Gartner. Gartner studied with Salo Baron, and after teaching for some years in the United States, immigrated to Israel and held a position at the Department of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University, from which he retired some years earlier at that time. Gartner began his career with a later-to-be classic study of Jewish immigrants in England during the mass immigration era, and in addition to numerous articles, published 3 studies, one on the Jews of Cleveland, one on the Jews of Los Angeles, and one on the Jews of Milwaukee. In response to my question, "What are you busy with these days?" Gartner responded with a smile, "I'm streaming with the tide of pinpointed specific studies and writing a book on the history of Jews in modern times." Subsequently, this book was published by Oxford University Press in 2001. Any attempt to document, categorize, and analyze comprehensive historical narratives demands posing a few preliminary observations and questions, most of which I will not address due to what Jacob Katz characterized as the, quote, 20-minute sodomite bed of academic lectures. Nevertheless, we cannot escape placing this phenomenon in wider context, even if in a preliminary fashion. As part of a wider European phenomenon in the second half of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, certain established scholars perceived their most serious challenge to offer an overview of Jewish history. Thus, for example, Heinrich Graetz, Geschichte der Juden, History of the Jews, that was translated to Hebrew during the last decade of the 19th century, Simon Dubnov's History of the Jewish People that appeared in Russian during the second decade of the 20th century in 1933 in Hebrew and in 1967 in English. Ben Zion Dinur's Toldot Israel that appeared in 1919, and his subsequent Israel in Diaspora, Israel Bagola, that saw the light of day in 1926. And Salo Baron's The Jewish Community, published in 1942. With the exception of Graetz's book, all the others appeared towards the end of the mass immigration era and during the interwar years, a period during which the American Jewish community became the second largest Jewish community in the world. Nevertheless, this community is almost absent from these historical overviews, or marginal at the most. This phenomenon of historical overviews lost its appeal, so it seems, as we approach the mid-20th century. This shift is a result, even if partially so, of the gradual growth and expansion of Jewish studies that enriched various subfields within it and complicated the task of writing sweeping overviews. It is also possibly tied to wider developments such as the rise of social history, the annals, and the ongoing rise of nationalism in Europe, which led to focusing on national and defined geopolitical regions rather than empire-like ones. Be it as it may, starting the second half of the 20th century, we evidence a change. Multi-volume historical narratives written by singular authors are gradually replaced by collections of articles, combined efforts of several scholars led by an editor or more, in which each scholar offers an overview of his or her field of specialty. Thus, for example, Louis Finkelstein's The Jews, Their History, Culture, and Religion in 1949, The Cambridge History of Judaism, or rather, to be precise, The Cambridge History of Ancient Judaism, should it be, in 1984, and La Société Juive, edited by Shmuel Trigano in 1992. Another development is multi-volume books, each volume of which is written by one scholar and offers an overview of the period he or she specializes in. For example, the 3-volume famous Toldot Am Yisrael, known as the Red Book, that appeared in 1969, the first of which devoted to the ancient period, Middle Ages, and modern, each volume. These appeared in English in one volume entitled The History of the Jewish People in 1976. American Jewry remains rather marginal in these volumes, notwithstanding the fact that following the Holocaust and throughout most of the second half of this 20th century, this is the largest Jewish community in the world. The ongoing marginalization of American Jewry may explain, at least in part, the emergence and ongoing phenomenon of single-authored comprehensive historical narratives of American Jewry. At this point, two brief observations are in place. The first is the subgenre of documentary histories, such as Jacob Rader Marcus's American Jewry in 1959, The Colonial American Jew in 1970, The United States Jewry, 1776 to 1985, 4 volumes that appeared between 1989 and 1993. Morris Shapes, A Documentary History of the Jews in the United States, published in 1950, and Mark Lee Raphael's Documentary History that appeared in 1983. These books that supply the demand for usable readers in academic courses do not explicitly offer a general narrative, but do so implicitly, even if only by the process of selecting documents. In certain cases, these massive documentaries preceded overall narratives. It's not only in America, such is also the case in Canadian Jewish history. David Rome, who is arguably the Jacob Marcus of Canadian Jewry, created the path for historians such as Gerald Tuchinski, who wrote overall analytical accounts of Canadian Jewry. The second observation is the aforementioned phenomenon of overall historical narrative based upon a combined effort of several scholars, each of whom wrote a volume focusing on their period of expertise under the oversight of a general editor. Thus, for example, The Jewish People in America, 5 volumes edited by Henry Feingold, in which each one of its 5 chronological volumes offers an account of a period in the history of American Jewry, emphasizing the classic migration and settlement periods and characterizing each period in the title of its volume. A time for planting, colonial, a time for gathering, the German period, a time for building, the mass immigration, a time for searching, interwar, and a time for healing, post-war. This emphasis on migration and settlement fits well with both the American collective founding ethos of migration and a nation of immigrants, and the strong scholarly notion of the critical impact that migrations have on American life. In contrast with other Jewish history academic scenes, such as Israel, in which we evidence a decline in publication of overall historical narratives in general, this trend seems to flourish in the American Jewish scholarly scene. Single-volume overviews written for the most part by senior and reputable scholars continue to appear every few years. This no doubt relates to the surrounding academic culture, to expectations and norms. In short, a chapter in the history and sociology of science that deserves further attention. Suffice it to say that it relates simultaneously to an ongoing trend of American scholars who offer overview narratives of American history, American religious history, Tom Tweed, William Hutchison, and going back, Sidney Olstrom, and so forth. The list is long. Or such narratives of Jewish communities, such as Paula Hyman's The Jews of Modern France, Todd Endelman's The Jews of Britain, and Sephardi Jewry between the 14th and 20th centuries of Esther Ben Bassa and Aaron Rodrigue, all American scholars. But at the same time, this phenomenon stands in sharp contrast with postmodern approaches that reject the legitimacy of overall narratives and the ability to offer such narratives, since their authors, like all scholars, the argument be, are subjective and bound by value-added agendas. It seems as though this postmodern notion has limited appeal within this specific context. So, we'll move along to the American Jewish scene. I would like to look into the structure of a few single volumes that appeared during the first 5 years of the third millennium and their implications. In 2003, Columbia University Press published Mark Lee Raphael's Judaism in America. And Oxford University Press published in the same year Hasia Diner's second edition of A New Promised Land, A History of Jews in America. These titles are reflective. Raphael emphasizes Judaism, namely the religious, cultural thread in the personal, familial, and communal layers of life, while Diner points to the collective community, the Jews. Unlike Raphael's descriptive title, Diner offers a meta-narrative, A New Promised Land, that naturally emphasizes various aspects of American Jewish history and marginalizes others. Diner's outline is chronological, and each chapter is devoted to a period in the history of American Jewry. The periods are defined along the lines of the aforementioned classic waves of immigration and settlement, thus emphasizing challenges and patterns of integration and accommodation to American society and culture. Raphael suggests a thematic outline, and focuses on beliefs, practices, theology, and religious institutions and organizations. By doing so, he implies that the meta-narrative is not historical and not waves of migration, but rather Jewish identity, religion, and culture. This route excludes, for example, by definition, widespread Jewish expressions that are not religious, such as socialist, Bundist, and communist. 2 books appeared in 2004, marking 350 years of Jewish settlement on American soil. Chassia Diner's The Jews of the United States, 1654 to 2000, by University of California Press, and Jonathan Sarna's American Judaism by Yale University Press. At a first glance, it seems as though these books follow in the footsteps of Raphael and Diner's previous books and set forth 2 distinctive narratives: Jews facing the challenges America poses versus Judaism confronting challenges, although somewhat different, and an historical narrative based upon waves of immigration versus religion and religious cultural identity. But these 2 books seem to offer a somewhat more complex narrative. While keeping the basic outline of chronological structure of migration, Diner divides the book into 3 parts. The first one is devoted to the colonial period and suggests looking at 2 sub-periods, the first until the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and the second during which the colonial Jew becomes America. The second part combines the German and mass immigration eras, thus offering an overview of a century of migrations of Jewish life and of Jewish politics. These are the 3 sub-chapters. And combining history from above and from the grassroots. The third part is devoted to the 20th century and divided once again to the classic chronological subdivisions of the interwar years, the mid-40s through 1967, and 1967 through 2000. But there's a slight change. Whereas in her first book, Diner states 1945 as the line between the first and second periods that follow the mass immigration, namely 1924 to 1945, and then 1945, 1967. In her second book, it's 1948 instead, emphasizing the establishment of the State of Israel rather than the end of the Second World War. As mentioned briefly, Sarna focuses on Judaism, religion, and culture. In other words, a thematic approach. But unlike Raphael, the structure of his chapters is chronological. The first 2 are structurally similar to Diner in the sense that he divides the colonial period into two sub-periods, pre- and post-revolution. The 2 following chapters address the German and mass immigration eras, respectively, although Sarna closes the mass immigration era in 1914 rather than the common 1924, since he marks the First World War as the beginning of a new era characterized by the establishment of overarching organizations, Jewish organizations, such as the Joint Distribution Committee, and the Jewish Welfare Board. Likewise, his final chapter addresses American Judaism since 1945, thus marginalizing the importance of 1967 as a crossroads for American Jewry in accordance with his focus on Judaism. These books clearly offer their readers different overall narratives of American Jewish history. Their foci differ. At certain junctions, they oppose one another. At others, they complement one another. And at times, they are very similar, if not identical. Notwithstanding the different routes that these authors lead their readers through, it is interesting to note that their minds meet to a great degree in their final chapters. Raphael emphasizes the retrieval quote of tradition, and Sarna entitled his last chapter, Renewal. They both focus on resurgence, revival, thriving religio-cultural innovations accompanied by strong energies and enthusiasm and devotion. Diner ends her first book emphasizing the crossroads since 1967, whereas the closing chapter of the second book, in which she discusses contemporary challenges, is slightly more optimistic in suggesting a, quote, search for continuity. They all seem to imply a somewhat optimistic, at times triumphalist tone with regard to American Jewry's success in Americanizing but yet maintaining Judaism, Jewish identity, and Jewish communal life in a wide plethora of expressions. This optimistic notion stands in sharp contrast with widespread popular American Jewish, sober and pessimistic accounts of the future of this Jewish community, some of which are shared by sociologists and demographers. Those who hold this grim outlook are surely comforted with the meeting of minds with highly regarded Israeli personalities, such as former member of the Israeli parliament and minister Yossi Beilin, and leading laureate Aleph Bet Yoshua. Be the differences between the aforementioned historical narratives as they may, they all offer covert criticism of the pessimistic, ever-dying American Jewish community and of American Judaism, and at times accompany their criticism with a touch of cynicism. On a personal note, I hope I am correctly depicting this optimistic notion, and that these historians are correct, as it possibly implies that American scholars of Jewish studies will not disappear either. This will enable us to continue this uncommon and yet much desirable and well-worthy discourse between contemporary Israeli and American scholars of Jewish studies. Thank you.